Now, before I get into the meat of my speech, I want to take you guys back 3 years. Think back to where you were just 3 years ago, just after the presidential election. Do you remember the despair, the frustration, even a palpable fear for the future of our country? For us Republicans, the news out of Washington was troubling. Recall the first few items crossed off the to-do list of our newly emboldened leaders and our newly empowered follower-in-chief. Drafting the so-called stimulus bill that would spend nearly $1 trillion on a Keynesian fantasy while millions of families lost their jobs and watched their savings disappear. Then they forced us to pay for overseas abortions while families were having a hard enough time paying for their own bills here at home. And it didn't stop there. Next came Obamacare, then the bailout, one industry after another. Then with our forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, there was confusion everywhere with chatter about random withdrawal dates that seemed to belie our actions on the ground and threaten our homeland security even more. Then there were plans for closing Gitmo, trying terrorists in Manhattan, giving the terrorists the same constitutional rights as the American men and women that they killed. Do you remember it? I know I do. In the face of all this uncertainty, the message to those of us who didn't like what we saw was to curl up in a fetal position and to stay there for the next 8 years, thank you very much. But now, oh, how things have changed. During those dark days when common-sense, patriotic Americans were looking for even the faintest sliver of hope behind the blackest clouds, they stumbled across something else, the Constitution. You see, a funny thing happened on the way to our assigned seats on the sidelines. Those of us who had toiled in the values movement for years suddenly found ourselves surrounded by friends and neighbors who had rediscovered the most fundamental value of all, liberty. Try as they might, the establishment elite will never have the last word on liberty, because there's something in our national DNA that gets our backs up when our liberties and freedoms are trampled on. And it leaves us saying, "You're not the boss of us." It's been that way for centuries. Perhaps said it a little more eloquently than I just did. He said, "The issue today is the same as it's been throughout all of history. Whether man shall be allowed to rule himself or be ruled by a small elite." Ladies and gentlemen, make no mistake. There are more of us than there are of them. Now, we don't always agree. We don't share the same strategy memos or talk off the same talking points. We certainly don't always endorse the same candidates. But what we share is a love for liberty and a willingness and eagerness to fight for it. Will the ruling elite come after us when they feel threatened? Yeah. Will they smear our backgrounds, distort our records? Of course they will. Will they lie about us, harass our families, and try their darndest to intimidate us back on the sidelines? You better believe it. There is nothing safe about what we're trying to do. But is it worth it? Well, let me ask you, are our inalienable rights worth a little alienation from the Beltway in crowd? Yeah. I say yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. Now, I was recently asked by a reporter whether I thought this grassroots passion that's propelling the movement, whether it's losing steam. And my reply was, "Oh, baby, you ain't seen nothing yet."
That's right.
If I do say so, I think we've been awfully patient so far. We've let the incremental assault on our freedoms, on our values, on free enterprise, on our property rights, and on our economic stability go on way too long. We've watched as the tentacles of big government have clawed their way into every area of our daily lives, from what light bulbs we can use to what toilets we can flush. We're told that we're heartless and somehow unpatriotic if we're sick and tired of government budgets increasing increasing every year, while hours are frozen or cut. While families are forced to make difficult cutbacks, whether it's the cable bill, or a family vacation, or a second car. And yet the government says it can't possibly live on the same budget it did a few years ago. This is not the America we know. This is not the America that my generation grew up with. I was a teenager in the Reagan years. It was a time of peace and prosperity. It was a time of big dreams and big ideas, when the only thing bigger than those dreams was our hair. As the Berlin Wall came down on our TV screens, we saw the hunger for freedom from the heavy boot of government. We saw the audacity of liberty as one lone student stared down a Chinese tank in Tiananmen Square. As the backlog grew in requests for political asylum, we saw the shining city on a hill beckoning to all to imitate and recreate the refuge that only freedom can build. The golden arches went up in Moscow. Family businesses became national chains like Walmart and Home Depot. We saw American economic genius and glory on full display. We saw what freedom can do. We saw what freedom must do. We saw what happens when people have control over their money, their property, their ideas, when they control their risk and their reward. And now we've watched the great American engine of prosperity seize up and stall out. Our job creators are on lockdown. Our economy has choked like it hasn't since the Great Depression. And we're told to just sit and watch as if we're powerless against it. And now, President Obama campaigns for re-election. He says he just needs more time, as if he's powerless against it. He says it's going to take a while to rebuild this great nation, as if the key to turning around the economy is locked in some secret mystery. Sorry, Mr. President, I'm not buying it. We are not buying it. For one, he's not trying to rebuild this nation, he's trying to redefine it. And it's taking a long time because we won't let him. When Ronald Reagan took the Oval Office, there was a double-digit inflation rate, record unemployment, gas lines and rationing that did not belong in a free America. When he stepped into office, he did what the so-called experts demanded. He raised taxes. But it didn't work. So he employed the economic principles that always made our country great. To increase revenue, you lower taxes and cut government spending, no matter how unpopular it is. These are not partisan principles. They're American economic principles that work, whether they're followed by a Democrat, as in the Kennedy years, or whether they're violated by a Republican, as in the Nixon years. Sorry, Alex. Nixon fan, we had that conversation over dinner. When President Reagan followed these principles, the economy turned around so quickly that he was able to campaign for re-election with the slogan, "It's morning in America again." Unlike President Obama, whose campaign re-election slogan is more of a campaign whine. "It's not my fault, I just need more time." He claims he needs more time to rebuild America, but it's not working. He's using socialist ideas to fix a capitalist economy. Now, socialism is when the government controls over 50% of the economy, whether it's public or private industry. Now, I'm not referring to the post-communist crony capitalism that's plaguing much of Eastern Europe today. I'm talking about America's economic system that is based on free markets that honor and serve the individual. A benevolent country's economy should always uphold and honor the dignity of every human being. That's why in America we should never legalize prostitution or sex trafficking, and it's why we abolished the slave trade.
Right.
One can argue there's certainly a free market demand for such things, yet they violate the sanctity and dignity of human life, so they have no place in America's economy. These principles of honoring and respecting every individual should direct all aspects of governing and servant leadership. Now, it's compelling to note that every time these principles are violated by totalitarian governments, economic disaster occurs. But unfortunately, most of the mass media has manipulated some into believing the emotional soundbite that to take care of the little guy, you must demonize the successful guy. The problem is that behind these soundbites is a set of complex ideologies that prove this simply is not true. The more you punish the successful, the productive, the prosperous, the harder it is for the little guy to join them. As a result, policies based on sentimental soundbites, as opposed to, say, centuries of quantifiable economic data, has brought about the gradual decline of partially socialized nations in Western Europe and now increasingly in the United States. So why are these soundbites gaining ground in the United States even when their fecklessness and destruction is on such graphic display throughout Europe and South America? Well, you can't possibly know that socialism destroyed Eastern Europe and is gradually doing the same in Western Europe if you haven't studied these issues. The communist and socialist soundbites we hear coming from Zuccotti Park might sound reasonable if you've never studied the horrors of Auschwitz or Lubyanka, the underground KGB prison they used to brutally torture people in Moscow during the height of the communist regime. How can one truly appreciate the principle of supply and demand if you've never seen the photos of the brutal winter bread lines in the Soviet Union? How can you know the liberating impact of free markets if you've never studied their impact on its societies? For the soundbite to be effective, good or bad, it must latch onto a value that already exists within the hearer, and that's where you come in. We have the power to defeat the soundbite because we have the truth on our side. The other side needs to resort to deception and lies and underhanded tricks. We just need to get better at conveying the truth in simpler soundbites. If our message is not resonating with voters, we don't abandon that message. We reframe it so that it resonates with the truth that is already within them. What I mean is that freedom is engraved on the heart of every human being. In our need to be valued, in our desire to be appreciated, in our longing to be loved simply for who we are, this is how freedom is engraved on our hearts. That quietly rewarding feeling that you get when you've sacrificed and your hard work has earned a better life for your children. When you use your God-given unique talent to provide for your family, or you've gone that extra mile and your boss appreciates it, or when you've sacrificed or when you've challenged yourself academically and you've earned a better grade than your classmates who haven't worked as hard. This is how freedom is engraved on our hearts. And only a free market economy that allows the individual to enjoy their risk and their reward can their hard work cradle and nurture true freedom. Only in a true, benevolent, free market can the entrepreneur spirit flourish and fuel that society's economy. Every person was created with a unique, unrepeatable preciousness that makes us uniquely who we are. By unrepeatable, I mean just that. It can't be repeated. Now, to explain what I mean, think of a loved one, whether it's a spouse, a parent, a sister, or another sibling. Now imagine if you could clone someone, and they cloned that loved one. Same DNA, same mannerisms, same voice, looked exactly the same as your mother, your father, your sister, or your husband or your wife. Would you have a spare loved one? Looks the same, talks the same DNA? No, that's absurd. Because there's that intangible something that makes us who we are. That unrepeatable dignity is where our worth comes from. That unrepeatable preciousness is where our value comes from. And when you use your unrepeatable, unique, God-given talents to make a better life for yourself, to work hard and make a better life for your loved ones, that's when freedom swells in our hearts. But when freedom becomes a soundbite about freedom for freedom's sake, as we see on Occupy Wall Street, freedom simply becomes license. True freedom is for the good. Freedom to work hard. Freedom to sacrifice. Freedom for righteousness. Freedom that leads to prosperity, not license that leads to tyranny. And a society filled with self-actualizers who value license above all else will self-destruct in a few decades. So if you care about the little guy, and if you want social economic justice that we hear the other side clamoring for, then you must fight to restore true, benevolent free markets in America. The sound bites about socialism may seem good on their surface. So one might perhaps believe that the problem isn't necessarily with socialist ideas, but rather with the corrupt governments that implement these ideas. The G20 summit just took place in France, so perhaps one can point to France's model of socialism as something that works. I mean, they require their citizens to pay almost 60% in taxes and social charges, which is a euphemism for taxes, but their folks get something in return. So why not model France's socialism the way we model their fashion, especially when France is supposed to be the epicenter of all things hip and cool? Well, there are two fundamental flaws with socialism that will always prevent it from ever having a place in America's economy. For one, socialism, even as practiced in France, cements the chasm between the social classes. Unless you already come from wealth, unless you already come from means, it is nearly impossible to get ahead, to create a better life for your family. When you're paying nearly 60 to 70% of your income in taxes and social charges, you simply can't earn enough to make ends meet for your family and to invest in your business, expand your lifestyle. If you were born dependent, you will most likely stay dependent. You see, the fundamental flaw with socialism that prevents the individual from truly flourishing is that under socialism, the individual exists to empower the government. In free societies, the government exists in a very limited way to empower the individual. Now, the second fundamental flaw with socialism is that it reduces the value of a person to that which is cost-effective. The person becomes a cog in the wheel. Last spring, we saw this perfect case study where there was a baby Joseph, a baby who was born in Canada with a terminal illness. And his parents wanted him to receive a tracheotomy that would make him more comfortable and allow that baby to come home and spend his last month with the family. But the hospital decided it simply wasn't cost effective to give such an expensive procedure to a baby who most likely wouldn't live a year. His parents petitioned the courts, but the courts decided that the hospital was in the right. It simply wasn't cost effective. Why waste those resources when the baby's going to die anyway? Now, fortunately, an American priest, Father Frank Pavone, heard about this and was able to bring the baby to America, where he was able to raise private donations to get baby Joseph the procedure that he needed. And baby Joseph was able to get off a respirator and spend his last month with his family. A couple months ago, the baby died at 20 months. Those extra months the family had with that baby are priceless, and they wouldn't trade them for anything in the world. That baby got to pass away peacefully at home, surrounded by loved ones. This is freedom. This is why we can never reduce the value of even the least of these to that which is cost effective. We learned from the evils of slavery and the horrors of communism that our society should never and can never put a price tag on a human being. Now, just this past week, we heard the news from the G20 summit in Europe that most of Europe is so beyond repair, and China has mercifully stepped up to bail them out. And now we've heard similar reports that the debt to GDP ratio in America is 100%. That means everything we owe is equal to what we bring in. There's no room for growth because our debt is so big. When this happens, our markets collapse, our economies collapse, our currencies collapse, and the budget that President Obama, in spite of all this, the budget he is proposing, even with the proposed tax hikes, will double our debt within 10 years. This is mutually assured economic destruction. So now what? We let China bail us out? Guys, we literally cannot afford 4 more years of this administration. Is the United States under siege from the socialist forces that are plaguing Europe and the rest of the world? Absolutely. Should we be worried? Definitely. Is it inevitable? No way. Remember the ending of the Cold War? There is a reason why a generation raised knowing nothing but Polish communism, who never experienced a day of freedom in their lives, could be so utterly transformed when a Polish Pope came to them and shared these truths with them. There's a reason why Berliners were dancing in the streets and the whole world with them when a cement wall came crumbling down. Because the heart takes one look at that picture and knows the difference between good and evil, between freedom and tyranny. And that's why when America was strong, solvent, and sovereign, President Reagan could sum up his foreign policy in 4 words: we win, they lose. Because there was never a doubt. There was never a doubt that America was always on the side of good, always on the side of freedom and liberty. Freedom, American exceptionalism. This is the reason why socialism has been slow to take in America than in the rest of the world. And our Constitution grants us freedom of press, and that freedom can be used for good. The great hope on which we stand is that if we find the right words and we use the media effectively, we have the distinct advantage of being right and being on the side of freedom. People already agree with us. They just haven't heard us. The truth we advocate is already on their hearts. The other side needs to rely on deception in order to win elections. We just need to get better at telling the truth, faster, with fewer words, with better, more powerful words. The United States was founded by a hodgepodge of misfits, troublemakers, small groups of investors and land grabbers, fringe religious groups driven from elsewhere trying to get free. There was not one thing in any cultural sense that united them. The one thing that did ultimately unite them was a document. The one thing that made them e pluribus unum, from many one, was the Declaration of Independence. But that declaration didn't just come down from the sky to Thomas Jefferson's pen out of nowhere. The Declaration itself insists that government serves something greater than itself. Government is the handmaid and guardian of something it did not create and cannot destroy. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words, or rather the ideas expressed in these words, are a natural immunization against socialism and tyranny and economic decay. As long as America is truly a country based on these ideas, as long as Americans, with their many, many differences, are truly united around these ideas, then America will stay America, and the infectious creep of socialism will be no more. I believe the American values enshrined in our Constitution and in our Declaration of Independence are not mere relics from the past, but rather the landing lights on a clear path to a strong and secure future. And I believe that these core values were worth fighting for then, and they're worth fighting for today. These same principles made our country great and will keep our country great. If we err, let it be on the side of liberty. If we stumble, let us pick ourselves up and press on. If we benefit, let it be from working hard and saving smart. Let us meet our obligations to God and neighbor by way of our own hearts and pocketbooks, rather than some cold government bureaucracy. To public servants who serve the public rather than themselves, and who put the next generation ahead of the next election. Let America make peace in our world and on our borders through strength, friendship, commerce, and good common sense. These are the values that built and can still rebuild a great nation. But it wasn't easy then, and it won't be easy now. We will be resisted, but we must resist as well. So I ask you tonight to join me in taking the same pledge as our first generation of dissenters. They only saw Lexington and Concord. They didn't see the dynasty of dissent that they were founding. They couldn't see Gettysburg, Normandy, or Fallujah. And what was required of them is still required of us, and will no doubt be required of our children and our children's children. Yet they took that pledge together, and that pledge closes out the Declaration of Independence. That same pledge will preserve this, the last best hope for our planet. Let us pledge now, as they did then, to one another and to posterity, for the sake of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We pledge our very lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. May God ever bless America. God bless you, and thank you.